Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Pieron. And continuing our theme about talking with authors, we do have William Bonk, known as Bill Bonk. He is going to talk with us about a very important topic for many, many veterans. And it's one of those things that doesn't get nearly as much attention as some of these other things that have happened, like at Quantico, like at a lot of places where we've had chemical exposures. And I'm talking about a facility, a base that tens of thousands, maybe a million people. I have no idea how many people went through there or lived in the immediate area, but there's lots of people that were exposed to a lot of things, but it really hasn't gotten the attention of Congress, and it really hasn't gotten the attention of the government because they said, well, I'm going to let Bill explain what they've said and why he has written a book. It's a fantastic book. It's called Exposure: Surviving Historical Fort McClellan. And Bill has gone and really aggregated the evidence. So you don't even have to trust him. You don't have to resolve on the interpretation. There's a lot of primary evidence. It's all government documents and sort of consolidated. There's a handy introduction. But Bill, thank you again so much for joining us. So let's go to the beginning. What happened at Fort McClellan, and why do people care?
Well, Tyler, thanks for having me on again. I really appreciate it, and I like the way you framed that at the beginning, so I might have to borrow that. I think probably the biggest mystery with Fort McClellan that's overlooked is the fact that it was the U.S. Army's chemical school from the 1950s until the 1970s. There was a 6-year break when they moved the chemical school up to Maryland, and it came back in 1979 and stayed there till 1999. So, for better part of, half a century, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just Army people that went to Fort McClellan to the chemical school. It was all branches of the service, because all branches didn't have chemical schools, basically, and foreign governments. I mean, I write about in the book about, Iraqis coming in and, we taught them how to use chemical weapons. A little disturbing when you find yourself in Iraq a couple decades later, right? And I think that's kind of overlooked, because as you look at all the government's response, they talk about, there's no adverse health conditions associated with service at Fort McClellan, yet they were using chemical weapons, biological weapons, a lot of them in the open air, right, before they built a special facility.
Mm-hmm.
The herbicides, solvents, heavy metals, all the things. And a lot of that, some of that's unique to Fort McClellan, but a lot of it's not, right? I mean, solvents, TCE was used all across the military, trichloroethylene to clean stuff and strip weapons and machinery and stuff like that. Fort McClellan was further complicated because Monsanto had their main PCB factory, by some estimates, 2 miles from the perimeter gate. So for 70 years, they were pumping polychlorinated biphenyls into the air, water, putting it in dumps.
So we're gonna have to pause and go, okay, you're talking about a lot of different chemicals, a lot of things that are, not necessarily just military. Obviously, the chemical and biological and those type of weapons are very much military, but PCBs, I've heard the phrase. What's to worry about that? Is Monsanto? It's a big company, right?
Well, so PCBs, not only PCBs, but there's a lot of other chemicals that were on Fort McClellan. They're man-made. And they're not what's the word, like biodegradable. They don't go away. Once they're in the environment, they're there forever, right? We see a lot about the PFAS and PFOA and all the forever chemicals now.
Mm-hmm.
The big thing they talk about with PCBs is that was in the older electrical transformers. That was the what what made the conductivity within the transformer or whatever, right?
Gotcha.
So you'll see documents about Fort McClellan where they talk about PCBs is almost 100% limited to electrical transformers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even some newspaper articles like where a transformer leaked, or um, PCBs are carcinogenic. They're very, very hazardous to humans and animals. But the DoD and the VA pretty much downplay any negative effects from PCBs coming out of Anniston just a couple miles away.
Like
There's a
like it's not their problem or it doesn't exist.
well, like, oh, that was, 5 miles over there, right? And it doesn't affect you on the military base, right? But they've found PCBs in the breast milk of Eskimo women, because PCBs are everywhere. They've pretty much polluted the globe or something. So it's hard to believe that, there was a CBS News special in the early 2000s where they talk about Anniston, Alabama, which connects to Fort McClellan.
I mean, that's
And
associated because I was stationed at Fort McClellan, just like you were, for a period of time. And Anniston is Fort McClellan, and now it's pretty much just Anniston, and there's still an
yeah,
Innocent Army Depot.
yeah. Well, there's still remnants of Fort McClellan that all of Pelham Range is still under National Guard control.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the main post is under National Guard control. And when you flash forward, the parts that remain under National Guard control are the most contaminated parts that I write about in the book that they didn't transfer to the Civilian Development Authority. They have land use controls, no digging, no planting, no burying, blah, blah, blah. So
Like, don't disturb anything, but you can have it.
it's pretty sad because today I actually received a FOIA request that I
Mhm.
submitted, and I'm gonna give props to the VA because I submitted a FOIA request on August 29th and I got the results today. So a
That's
month.
pretty darn fast. Most of the time,
So
they don't even acknowledge it in 30
yeah,
days.
and I got what I was looking for. I had read a Board of Veterans Appeals citation that mentioned a memo referencing contamination at Fort McClellan. And
Mm-hmm.
they used this memo to deny the claim. So I filed the request. I actually got it today. And it's kind of amazing because the memo is dated in 2015,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we're talking almost 10 years old. They quote in 2015 a report from 1977, right? 38 years before that, that says, there was this 1977 report that basically said, there's no harm to chemicals at exposure at Fort McClellan or something like that.
I think
And
our
that
science
19,
has improved a little bit since 1977. I mean, I remember DDT and a whole host of other things that they said were totally fine until they realized no, it wasn't fine at all.
yeah, but see, that's the thing. You mentioned DDT, right? And DDT is not on the radar of the VA, right? That's not a thing. So, herbicide exposure, if it's 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, picloram, tachydilyc acid, or dioxin, all associated with herbicides used in Vietnam, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't remember when they banned DDT. I want to say it was like 75, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But Fort McClellan still had it in their inventory in the 80s, and they didn't turn it over to DRMO until like 85.
Hmm.
So even though it was banned, they still had it, and it's documented in government reports, right? And DDT is a pretty bad, it,
It's a horrible chemical. We almost lost every American eagle because
yeah,
of it.
I mean, and there's other ones. There's like chlordane, which they used for, roach control and whatnot, and they sprayed it in military housing and around foundations and stuff. And the more you peel back the onion, the worse it gets. Um, and it's funny because this FOIA memo I got today, um, it almost focuses exclusively on Agent Orange, right?
Hmm.
But the Agent Orange Act of 1991, which doesn't mention Agent Orange in it, by the way, it mentions those 5 herbicides or byproducts that I mentioned earlier. Um, it, so Agent White was basically picloram and Tordon 101, which were commercial herbicides at the time.
Right.
And they have a byproduct like how 2,4-T had the dioxin. Tordon 101 had, or Agent White had HCB, hydrochlorobenzene, which is more dangerous, I think, than dioxin. And then the cacodyllic acid, which was Agent Blue, had arsenic as a byproduct, right? Which is equally bad. I mean, arsenic, I write about it in the book. There's 20 or 30 places where they found high concentrations of arsenic. And it's like these contractors doing the reports always say like, well, it was naturally occurring or something, and I'm kind of like, hey, it's not like Fort McClellan was an apple orchard and there were apple seeds everywhere or something. And
Yeah.
like when you rise up above it, peel back the layers of the onion, and then you see all these details, right? Um, and you connect those dots, it's really disturbing. And then I think what's equally disturbing is when you bring it to the attention to the decision makers at the VA, they just kind of shrug. They're like, oh, okay, thank you. Like, I
So,
don't
so
know.
to
Very
summarize,
frustrating.
there's a lot of chemicals that were being used at Fort McClellan that's been validated, it's been tested, they found it in the soil, and because Fort McClellan shut down, what, 99,
Right.
it was bracked, it was no longer going to be an active base, and they had to turn over most of it to the civilians, to the state and town of Anniston, Alabama. They said, oh, well, we got to look and make sure that there's no chemical things and nothing bad from the military use, munitions and things like that. And they're finding all these chemicals all over the place. A lot of it has to do with both herbicides, but also chemical weapons that have been used in the open air. And if we go back in the 50s and 60s, we know that they were still testing people with radiation, out there, soldiers even. And the VA does recognize that people that were test dummies for radiation exposure. But at Fort McClellan, they're going, not really. Sort of just was there, a little bit here, a little bit there. And there's a lot of consequences to this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I harp a little bit on the herbicides. I try to stay away from the use of the word Agent Orange.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of hearsay. There's a lot of people to be like, oh, there were these leaking barrels and I had to guard them and all this kind of stuff. And that may or may not be factual, right? I tried to only use what I could verify through government reports in the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but the components of Agent Orange, of Agent White, I mean, there was 160,000 gallons in the 70s. 100 is like, actually, it's like 180,000
That's like
gallons.
several Olympic pools
Yeah, like
of
tanker trucks,
yeah.
like 7,000 gallons. A fire truck, like I don't even know where they would have stored the place. And I find it amazing that I think it's more than a coincidence in like 74, 75, 76 when they had 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T and Silvex, which contains the 2,4,5-T. Um, that's when the Vietnam War was winding down. This is the Army Chemical School. This is where they trained the chemical corps people in Vietnam that were backpack sprayers and spraying off of helicopters and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Were trained at the chemical school. But then you're
Right.
going to be like, so what? We didn't use actual herbicides. And the VA makes they're trying to make this big distinction between commercial herbicides and tactical herbicides.
I,
And
I saw that, and I'm sorry, but What is the difference?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a guy named Dr. Alvin Young who's they call him Dr. Orange. He's the government's Agent Orange expert, right?
Hmm.
And he was a lieutenant during Vietnam in the 60s, and then they allowed him a deferment to get his PhD and all this stuff. And so it's really interesting if you look through his work in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and beyond. He's been contracted by the DOD, by the DOJ, by the VA, by Monsanto and Dow and the Soybean Association. But, and, GAO, the Government Accountability Office, and the VA, and the DOD, the Armed Forces Pest Management Board, they like live and breathe by what this guy wrote, right? But if you go back and look at it, which I've done extensively and I'm doing now as a part of the next updated book that I'm writing, he contradicts himself, but he flat out says in 2013 in a report contracted by the VA, there is no difference between the dioxin in commercial herbicides or tactical herbicides. Yet
So
the VA,
there is no difference.
no, I mean, and if you go back to the 60s, in 1962, the Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government put out in newspaper articles that they were going to begin this herbicide spraying using commercial herbicides that have been in use in the USA and Russia and other places.
Hmm.
So like we either lied to the world when we told the Vietnamese that, we were using commercial herbicides, or we're just ignoring the truth somewhere down the line, right?
I mean, the reality is that the government always buys something that exists.
Right.
Especially if you need large amounts of it. It's not like, we make up new things. Sometimes that happens, but usually it goes right back. If it works really well, then it goes right back into the commercial, and people are going to use it commercially because it works really well. It's
Right.
kind of like all the things NASA develops. So it
Exactly.
sounds like a pretty misnomer to say a tactical herbicide versus, Roundup. Like
Yeah. And based on my research of everything I could get my hands on in the unclassified realm, the word the combo words of tactical herbicide didn't surface till 2006 when Dr. Young wrote about it in a VA paper. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
sorry, 2006. He was contracted by the DOD. So like in his contemporaneous writings in the 60s and 70s, he basically lists, and he wrote a pamphlet, he did some other stuff, and he actually lists like the 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 chemical name, the trade name, the nickname, and the military name or something. They're all synonyms, right? They're all the same
Mhm.
thing. And
Sure.
then we didn't split hairs until Vietnam veterans started filing claims, and then suddenly there was the Blue Water Navy stuff, the Brown Water Navy stuff.
And
Um,
that's all in relation to Agent Orange exposure, right?
right.
In and
But
around Vietnam and the territorial waters.
right. And the thing is, even that, there's so much, I'll just say, I don't want to say controversial, conflicting maybe. They write so much about how much care was taken not to spray Allied troops, right? That they would go in and spray an area before, you know, the US and their allies moved into an area, right? That and usually it was hostile, and they had to have fighter cover with the spray planes and all this stuff. Um,
But then
it,
you're
it,
walking through it. I
yeah, and
mean,
then
that's the.
exactly. But then the other thing is they talk about, so the Armed Forces Pest Management Board, which was created in the late 50s, had no control over tactical herbicides. They had control over commercial herbicides bought for 600 bases around the world, right?
Mhm.
But like inside a perimeter base in Vietnam was the responsibility of the Armed Forces Pesticide Management Board working with the base engineer, right?
Mhm.
But then they would talk about how they would drain those 55-gallon barrels, they would drain out the last gallon or two, and they'd use it for like spraying around the perimeter, and they had to get permission from the Army Chemical Corps to spray like around the perimeter and stuff. But then you think, well, now we're spraying Agent Orange or White or whatever, right where there's actually people, right? So you're an MP, you're in a guard tower, you're in a gun emplacement, you're an
Mm-hmm.
infantry guy, you got guard duty, right? I mean, you're a
And you're
transportation
walking.
guy, you're driving through the gates or something. So now you potentially, according to the way they write it, you're exposing these soldiers, maybe, people at a field hospital,
Mm-hmm.
more than you're exposing, when you're spraying the jungle or main supply route or something. I don't know. It's very frustrating. But you know,
Because one of the big takeaways about Agent Orange is they denied any link for decades to so much of these problems that veterans were having, these cancers and these congenital defects with children and
yeah.
spina bifida. And so there's a lot of parallels to this with McClellan and Vietnam and the use of chemicals and really not being upfront about what was used, what was there. And I think part of it is there's a lot of lost history. People just don't know. And like a certain recalcitrance to even addressing the issue because the issue of exposure and covering things up. But you've had the same expert witness for what, 40, 50 years now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, you and I are both law enforcement, and I've seen expert witnesses come on paid to say almost anything. And if I want an opinion, I can find one. I can find an expert opinion. Somebody will give it to me if I pay them enough money. We've all watched court TV at some point or another. I'm not going to say motives are bad, but when you have the same person giving contradicting evidence over the years, uh, I'm a scientist. That's good when people change their views,
Right.
but not when they change their views when it's politically expedient or depending on who's paying them.
Yeah, and I think what's frustrating is lack of recognition amongst the decision makers who won't recognize that, And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you look at Camp Lejeune, right? Camp Lejeune had, the president on their side, they had celebrities on their side. Fort McClellan, they, we don't have a celebrity spokesperson, right? We just have a crappy situation that we're trying to deal with. And I will say, since the PACT Act came out, it's changed everything for a lot of Fort McClellan veterans. I mean, they are now getting service connected for toxic exposure risk activities that they never would have. The VA would have denied it. They wouldn't have passed go. They wouldn't have got $200. Nothing. They were just denied. So that's a good thing, but it's
Yeah,
not
that's
good
fantastic.
enough.
Yeah.
It's just um,
Do you think the PACT Act is sort of a back end to recognizing and sort of acknowledging that there's an issue, but without really addressing the issue?
man, I hate to say it, but I sort of feel like there's an element of luck involved for Fort McClellan veterans and other veterans
Oh, yeah.
when it comes to the toxic exposure risk activity stuff because they're kind of forced to do it. Um, that memo I got today, I mean, their conclusion was there's, in 2015, from 2015 until 2022, 2023, when things started to turn a little bit, man, it was literally like those crash test dummies running into a brick wall. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody, I don't know anybody and I've had contact with thousands of Fort McClellan veterans. I don't know one who got service connected for a disability at a regional office level,
Mm-hmm.
and
Like, you mean like their first initial request for benefits?
right. And even some that had medical records because say they were, a truck driver and I don't know. There's the the handful of people that got service connected all were at the Board of Veterans Appeals or the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. And it
Mm-hmm.
took them years
So they had to fight and fight and fight.
and fight some more. Now it's truly amazing. I mean, I'll get an email like people are like, "Hey, I got 100%, I got 50%, I got and it's the VA's acknowledging exposure to PCBs, to herbicides. Um, it's really been a game changer. One thing I was going to mention, I don't know if you've seen it in the book, probably not. but there's a part where these the trainers who were training the use of herbicides actually they were ingesting the herbicides to show how safe they were, right? And then we flash forward, like you said, and then so the DAV and the MOAA, the Military Officers of America Association, I think, they just came out with a joint report that they determined it takes 34 years to get access to benefits out of these like toxic exposure things. So if you think like Vietnam and how long that took, or Gulf War veterans, what's happened there. I mean, it's really unfortunate, and I think that's really my main driver on why I wrote the first book and why I keep hacking away at it. And it literally gets worse and worse every time. The more you pull it back, the deeper you go. Like I was talking about all that stuff with the herbicides. It's the same thing with radiation. I mean, they closed when the chemical school moved to Maryland in 1973. There's government reports that say at the time it was the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, but it said the AEC and the Army agree to leave these 3 spots contaminated with radiation in the building because of time, money, and expense, right? That building became the MP school. Okay. So then for and they're like, oh, well, it's in the ventilation and it's been sealed, right? So you're like, and I don't know if you remember the MP Museum at Fort McClellan. It was in a W-shaped building, right? And that was the former radiological lab for the chemical school. So I just remember there was on the one end of the W was a big company-sized classroom where we went for like map reading and stuff like that. And the only reason I really remember this from 1982 is because when I had to go to the latrine, the restrooms were right outside the doors of the MP Museum, but we were never allowed. I was never in the MP Museum, right? We're never allowed, right? We were standing at parade rest during our breaks on the outside of the building. But that building, they left contaminated as well in 1973, and they didn't remediate that till the 80s. Right. So how many hundreds of, and maybe it wasn't everybody that sat in that classroom, but you and I sat under the ventilation for days on end. The same thing on Pelham Range. They had a like a radiological detection site on Pelham Range that was 1 mile by 2 miles wide. And
that's a pretty big area.
It was used by the people in the chemical school who were doing radiological detection at the time in the 50s and the 60s for like an A-bomb detonation. So I'm just going to throw this number out there, but say they had 1,000 holes in the ground, and they basically had like a fishing rod to raise and lower radioactive isotopes, cobalt 60 and cesium 137. So they could change the readings, right? If you go out there with the radiac meter or whatever, however that's done. But then they when they shut it down in the 60s, they lost some of this stuff. They forgot about it. They left, and they had a radiological dumping ground out there, burial mounds where they brought radiologically contaminated stuff from Main Post and buried it out there. Well, guess who used Pelham Range and Rideout Hall and Rideout Field for a decade or two for maneuver stuff? The MP Corps.
And moving things around and driving and walking.
Yeah, so like when we did the
and probably
the convoy
camping
security stuff, we would do convoy security. For anybody that did it back in the 80s and 90s, dog tag 1, dog tag 2, you do the ambushes and all that stuff. That was all on Pelham Range on Rideout Field, where the and maybe you and I pitched our little GP tiny tent over top of this, piece of radiation that they left. And I write about it in the book, but there's a speck that's as big as a needle head or something. And they said it's like 7 million times the background rate that you should be exposed to or something like that. Right. But
like you can be exposed to radiation from bananas, but that's a very minor little thing. But this is a lot, very powerful, so much so that the sensors at distance were designed to detect them for atomic fight. And that's the radiologic from the NBC Corps that were out there for years and years. And so one of the things I really liked about the book, I'm like halfway through it. I've picked and choose. I read things straight through, but I've been sort of picking and choosing. And now it's a thick book, folks. It's called Exposure: Surviving Historical Fort McClellan. One man's battle for Fort McClellan, veterans and their families. It's by our friend here, Bill Bonk, William Bonk. And I'll put the link up in the Amazon link and everywhere else you can find it. It's available everywhere. It's a great resource. But one of the things I really like about the book, Bill, is the fact that you wrote it with all the evidence. We were talking beforehand that it's almost like writing it like a search warrant or like a case file when you're a criminal investigator. I'm not making the judgments. Here's the evidence. Here's the evidence. Here's the evidence. Here's this. Here's that. And you can really form your own views and sort of the layout of the evidence as opposed to, well, I heard stuff. We've all heard, stories from soldiers, and sometimes they're a little more true than others. And other times they get a little exaggerated, especially as time goes on. And sometimes people are just, they're trying to get benefits and they're trying to exaggerate a little bit. But there's not a lot of exaggeration with the core evidence and government documents. And that's, I think, an important caveat with the book. So, folks, go check it out. If you know somebody that served at Fort McClellan, it's a great resource, especially if they're having problems now, especially with the PACT Act. We've talked about the PACT Act a lot, and the exposure to all these things is really brought into focus with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, where we are burning everything and all sorts of chemical exposure, depleted uranium out of the M1 rounds, a lot of things that are causing a lot of problems, and people didn't know why. Goes back to the first Gulf War as well. People were having all of these issues, but really couldn't put a finger on what it was. And most of the time, it's because they're exposed to a whole bunch of crap that takes years to develop, and all of a sudden they've got problems. Well, with the PACT Act, they can get help. And if they're at Fort McClellan, you ought to go definitely have them go check out the book. It's a fantastic read. But one of the things I really liked about it, Bill, and this is one of the really good sort of comments, is the discontinuity of corporate memory. You have a whole section in there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, those are excuses, right? That the Army ended up using. And I want to backtrack just a second because that is a thick book, but that's the second edition, and I made it specifically for more mature audience, as in more mature eyeballs.
And he needs bigger text. Yes.
Bigger font. Yes.
As I hit a certain age, I started using glasses a little bit here and there, and I was able to read it no problem. The original book is smaller with the smaller font. But regardless of your age, it's an easy to read text and format in the most current edition. I think there's a newer version coming.
And I do want to add too that I probably, if I could have changed anything, I would have broadened the horizons a little bit beyond Fort McClellan.
Mm-hmm.
But
like Anniston and the surrounding area?
No, I mean, like it's the chemicals, it's the exposure. And even if you didn't go to Fort McClellan, if you were at Fort Ord or in Panama or Germany, trichloroethylene is trichloroethylene, benzene's benzene, vinyl chloride's vinyl chloride,
And these were used at bases everywhere.
Yes, and ships everywhere, right? And the thing is, if I get back to the discontinuity part, it's the government a couple times. So they did that when they were shutting down the school in 1973 to move to Maryland. They basically said, there's too much contamination here. We only have an OIC and 2 people in this unit to deal with it. So they started doing
the guys
this
that are sort of like packing up the last bits of things.
Yeah.
And so you guys are in charge. And we're like,
So they started doing basically like selective enforcement, like you do with speed control or stop sign running or something like that, right?
Right.
And then they've basically the discontinuity part was basically they didn't have good records, right? And it's still there today. Like if you go back and look at a lot of these reports, there was a bunch of wild ass guessing going on. There was a bunch of, they lost several ranges. They didn't know where they were at. They couldn't find Lima Pond for a few years. It's really disturbing. And then you think there's people sitting in a cubicle somewhere at the VA deciding your fate on exposure and denying your claim. And it's based on nothing. It's based on, or it goes the other way, right? Like there's no, you know, so like here's me,
The absence
40,
of evidence is not evidence of absence.
yeah, I have to remember that. But I mean, proving the negative or something like that too, like how do I go, they tell me 40, 50 years later, because I still see it every day. People email me, VA's asked me about radiation exposure. So I have this nice like 5-page document that's chronicalized, shows all the dates and times and the things. And, but like, you're 17, 18, 19-year-old private, right? I mean, you're living and breathing by what the drill sergeant tells you to do or something. You're not, you can't question anything. You can't be like, hey, what's that sign with the skull and crossbones on it? Or,
Right.
Hey, I mean, I can't tell you how many people were going down with upper respiratory infections or welts or hives or who knows, they were spraying for chiggers, for fire ants, for,
I had
kudzu,
the
all
worst.
kinds
I
of
had the
stuff.
worst chigger infection of my life at Fort McClellan. I remember to this day, and I've done a lot
Yeah.
of things, and that was just, and that red clay absorbs
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
I had uniforms permanently stained because you just can't get that out. But that goes to show you the chemicals that are in there are also embedded and rubbing against skin, and you're up
Well,
close and tight with that ground, and it's not like a loamy foil or soil everywhere else where it's
yeah.
just
And then
dirt.
where'd you put those dirty clothes at nighttime? You put them
Yep.
in that canvas or that cotton bag tied to the end of your bunk, and then you slept 2 foot away from it or whatever, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's just,
It
a
boggles the
tough,
mind.
it's tough because, I can only say, one of two things will happen. I'll either die trying or we'll get recognition for Fort McClellan veterans, on par with other locations. And, I'll say every ship and post had a lot of these chemicals, right? As a matter of fact,
It was
the
kind of like
same,
asbestos. It was the best to use at the time, but we
yeah,
didn't realize how dangerous it was.
but look at the same chemicals that were at Ground Zero in New York are the same chemicals that were in burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan and Djibouti and all that are the same chemicals at Fort McClellan. It's all the, methyl chloride. It's all the same stuff. And as a matter of fact, I've done comparisons where the burning, it just went in kind of different ways, right? At Fort McClellan, they were burning hospital waste. They were burning pallets that had the PCP, the pentachlorophenol wood preservatives and stuff, which also puts off the same dioxin as 2,4,5-T, the half of Agent Orange, right? So they were burning munitions. They were burning chemical weapons. They
Yeah,
did
that's
in
how
the
you got rid of
50s.
stuff.
In the 50s and 60s, they did secret biological tests. They put simulants out into the community, and it's kind of funny because it's not funny at all, but it's ironic, I guess. If in the book, I think it's 1952, then the year they did the biological release on Fort McClellan, there was a 500% spike in pneumonia cases in Calhoun County. And it's like it's funny if you go back and look at the newspaper articles, the commanding general's like, oh, there's no relation, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, you let go a biological weapon unknowingly, the pneumonia cases spike for that year, and then and they don't do it the next year or something. And I don't know, it's kind of ridiculous, but
It does boggle
again,
the mind. So in the book, you have the discontinuity of corporate memory, and I thought this was a really good encapsulation of both the Agent Orange discussion in Vietnam and everywhere else. Oh, we don't have records because people move in the military, right? We come, we go, and corporate memories get lost. if it's not a permanent activity that is there explicitly to do something, the records don't get kept. Just like where they lost the ranges, just like those type things evolve and change. And there was a few things I thought were really interesting. From 1952 to 1957, they were doing classified work out of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. What is Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and why should we care about that?
Well, I mean, I don't, I'm not really big on all that. I mean, I know they were doing, nuclear
The
A
atomic
bomb,
energy.
yeah, the bomb testing and all that stuff. And they, and see, they hide behind a lot of that because they didn't have licenses to even possess
Hmm.
the isotopes that they had until like sometime into the 60s, I think.
Yeah, you
And
were
they
t
had leaks.
yeah.
I mean, there's there were leaks all around that building that was the MP Museum 3182 and the chemical school and stuff.
Hmm.
And it's just what's so cool, I think, is the verbiage of there's a statement in there. It's something about, the ionizing radiation crept about the laboratory or something like that is
Yeah,
the words
crept
they use.
about.
Crept about and then I thought too was what was kind of fascinating was the part about that radiological field on Pelham Range.
Hmm.
They and that's why the chapter is called I forget what chapter is, chapter 8 maybe or something, but it's called Painful Mind Hotel.
Hmm.
And that was the radio call sign for the tower at
Ah,
Rideout Field. So Painful Mind Hotel, and you go, that's not even like um what do you call it? The
nickname.
phonetic alpha,
Yeah,
phonetic alphabet, right? Painful
right.
Mind Hotel. And then you're like, does somebody have a sense of humor with that? And then, the roving patrols were Painful Mind Hotel 1, Painful Mind Hotel 2 and stuff. And I don't know, I found it took, I think I mentioned this before, but I spent 3 years researching to write this book. I mean,
Hmm.
because I had to teach myself a lot because when I first thought about, I was looking at filing a claim related to the Gulf War, and then I stumbled on the Fort McClellan stuff, and it kind of coincided with some health issues I had had, and so I was sort of between like filing a claim and writing the book. Or I actually wasn't initially writing the book; I was making a timeline, and then I thought, oh, this would be helpful because I didn't know. There's no real answers based on sort of just comprehensive information like these government reports, right?
Right.
And you'd hear a lot of hearsay and stuff, and I didn't know what the VA knew or what the government knew because I honestly thought like after I put this book out, there'll be black SUVs showing up at my house or something, or somebody, and it's like they have nothing, and it's even evidenced by today when I get this stupid memo from dated 2015, and they're referencing a 1977 report, and
Right.
I've had email exchanges with officials at the VA, and they'll quote like one line out of a report. The 1986 report said this. And I go, yeah, but if you read the next sentence, it says that, and
You know,
it
I've
totally
often
contradicts.
I've often found that they are repeating something from someone else who extracted that line, and they've never actually read the report themselves. They're just cutting and pasting and without really examining the issue in depth. So
Yeah.
McClellan closed in '99. Now that's
Yes.
like 25 years ago. I don't do math in public, but it's been a good while. And gosh, it makes me feel old because I was there in '92, but uh, it's been closed since '99. Has the government been forced to clean it up? Has there been any sort of, state of Alabama or
I mean,
fun,
that's,
super fun site or one of those type things where they've gone in and tested and said, oh boy, this is not safe for human habitation?
I mean, honestly, it's just an extension of the goat rope. I
Hmm.
mean, it just, I have a 2019 memorandum between the Alabama Department of Environmental Management and the McClellan Development Authority, which is the private entity that took it over for
Hmm.
redevelopment. And I think there's 55 locations in 2019 that have land use controls on them. No
And tell us
digging.
what land use is.
Well, no digging, no wells, no no planting, no building houses,
Like,
whatever,
don't
blah, blah, blah.
disturb the soil, don't
Yes.
go there.
So when 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 the fort closed in 1999 and the land was turned over, it was called the JPA, the Joint Powers Association or something. They changed their name to the McClellan Development Authority. The Army gave them $148 million along with a good chunk of the land. A lot of the land, so they go through these processes. I think there were 102 separate site investigations, but some of them were never completed. Some of them, they turned the land over contaminated to the civilian authority, and then the civilian authority works with the uh, Alabama Department of Environmental Management and the EPA to clean it up and stuff. So they hired different contractors, and it's disturbing. It's
And how do they
because
clean it up? Like, take out the soil?
yeah, I mean
What is
it's
that? What's
it's
involved?
yeah, a lot of it's just it's stripping out the soil. But honestly, as far as I could tell right now today, as we sit here, there's a 27 million pound plume of trichloroethylene under Fort McClellan, Anniston, and Anniston Army Depot in the groundwater. But
Wow.
it's no hazard. It's nothing to worry about. Um,
And that's
there's
from the
plumes.
Monsanto plant?
No, this is from, so trichloroethylene is like a very powerful solvent stripper.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And you use it like to clean machinery and things.
yeah, to like strip the paint and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And to clean weapons, and those high pressure chambers and all that stuff. But I recently saw that 90% of all trichloroethylene used by the DoD was used where? Anniston Army Depot. Anniston Army Depot is a heavy vehicle refurbishing place.
Yeah,
They get
like a
combat vehicles.
depot level
Deep, right,
maintenance.
exactly. So but like, and nobody's disturbed by that. Like 90% of TCE in the DoD, because I see a lot of people filing claims all across, the different services and talking about, I, as a Nike Herc dude, we use TCE to clean the missiles or blah, blah, blah. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, 90% is used at Anniston Army Depot, right? Which
So as
is,
the old vehicles come in, as they get retrofitted, they get cleaned up with these chemicals to strip everything off.
yeah. And yet, Anniston Army Depot adjoins Pelham Range on the north side of Anniston Army Depot, south side of Pelham Range.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's an article in the Anniston Star newspaper that talks about the different molecules of TCE, and they say one of the like, I don't know how many molecules there are. I think it's like there's 4 or something, but one of them comes from like Fort McClellan. So,
Mm.
from cleaning weapons or whatever, something getting into the groundwater. But like, there's chloroform in the groundwater. There's all kinds of these, it's the same. There's vinyl chloride, benzene, TCE, and perc, which are the same 4 chemicals that basically contaminated Camp Lejeune, right? So you have and you have those same 4 chemicals are in the groundwater under Fort McClellan. Then you have heavy metals, you have herbicides, you have, solvents, you have PCBs, you have ionizing radiation, you have the chemical and biological warfare stuff. And then it's like, there's a website the VA has for Fort McClellan, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
acknowledges that some people might have been exposed to PCBs in the town of Anniston, chemical warfare material, or radiation. That's it. They don't
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge herbicides. They don't acknowledge solvents or anything else. But it says right at the bottom of that page, but there are no adverse health conditions associated with Fort McClellan service. And that's the rub to me. That's the conscious bias. That's the bullshit, right? That's where, if you were at any other fort anywhere else in the world, you could probably make a claim and not get shot down. But because somebody put this memo out that I got today, and they have that website that's been up since 2015, it just like delete, denied, it's
Oh,
just,
if it's Fort McClellan, say no. If it's anywhere else, maybe.
yeah. I mean, honestly, I mean, that's kind of how I see it. And then you kind of alluded to it earlier too. It's like this cut and paste thing, because I get the same stuff from like the Secretary of the Army, almost the same kind of verbiage of, we've done reviews and we haven't found anything. And then it's like, well, how come I'm looking through stuff and I found 10 instances of PCB contamination on Fort McClellan, a lot of it after it closed, right? Same thing with the dioxin and the components of the herbicide agents. A lot of that goes up the testing 2008, 2006, 2004. I mean, what do you think was going on in the 70s and 80s and 90s when we were there?
Right.
I mean, we have no idea.
So let me put this home for our audience. If you served at McClellan or lived in Anniston or your family was there, what are the sort of symptoms or diseases or things that they may be experiencing that could be associated with service at McClellan, regardless of what the VA is currently saying?
I mean, honestly, it could be just about anything in the lineup of cancers and respiratory ailments and, especially kidney and liver stuff because of the solvents in the water and the PCBs. All those 18 or 19 presumptive illnesses related to herbicides, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, hypothyroid, all that stuff. I mean, people are successfully getting service connected now because of the PACT Act. The difference being it's not presumptive, right? So you have to go in there with a direct service connection. You have to have a current diagnosis. You have to have an in-service event or, the TERA, the toxic exposure risk activity, and preferably a nexus letter, right? That's the hard part for everybody, right? Because a lot of VA medical personnel don't want to do nexus letters but it's kind of changing because with the TERA, you really don't need a nexus letter. The CNP contract examiner will kind of fulfill that role, but you're rolling the dice then, right? You're taking your chances with the VA's contracted person, and that's 50-50, right? Or it might even be a 70-30 split against you.
But it depends.
But the good thing is you have options, right?
Right.
At least now you can get into the system, you can file. What I've seen a lot of is people will have some success with their claim and things will be deferred and things will be denied. But now you have an avenue. You can do a higher level review. You can do a supplemental. You can go to the BVA if you want to. Honestly, I have a higher level review in right now. I'm filing a new supplemental and I have something that's been at the BVA for like 2 years, right? So it's, and I don't use a VSO or a lawyer or anything. I do it myself. And I did it because I wanted to see how intuitive the system was. And I can tell you it's not very.
No, it's not. And that's something we talk a lot about on this show is sort of the process. It is sort of straightforward, except that the evidence that they accept and the causal connections aren't always achievable by a layman.
Yes, exactly. And I actually, in one of my claims, wrote a statement and I said I could have been standing next to Dr. So-and-so and the secretary drinking endocrine disrupting fluid, and you guys are still going to deny it because there's no adverse health conditions associated with Fort McClellan service. And that's the one I have at the BVA right now, which I expect it'll be favorable only because it's now a presumptive Gulf War thing as well. So I might not get
might not be McClellan, but Gulf War and that the PACT Act has definitely changed the conversation where a lot of these things were always, because of the length of time between the service and the event coming to fruition.
The latency, really. I mean, that's a big thing, and it's often ignored. I mean, the latency is huge. I mean, and there's a lot of I mean, like kidney cancer, that takes 10 or 15 years to manifest or something. It might not show up. So that whole thing where, it didn't show up within a year of you getting out, it's like,
right. And now there's a way to move forward with that.
Yeah.
Especially with all this different exposure. Bill, I'm gonna wipe the slate clean real quick and ask you, what should I have asked you about but didn't about your book, which is exposing Exposure, Surviving Historical Fort McClellan, One Man's Battle for Fort McClellan Veterans and Their Families. I should have asked you a million questions. It's a really good read of the half that I've read so far, and I've got all these notes and tabs and interesting things because I didn't know, especially the radiological things. I knew about chemical stuff. We've heard it about at other bases. We hear a lot about Agent Orange, mainly because of the veterans that have been fighting for decades
Right.
that are recognizing, hey, this caused problems, and finally the science caught up. So, with all that, what should I have asked you about but didn't?
Well, I got two things, Tyler. One is you should have asked me if I would do it all over again.
That's
And
a fair question.
the answer would be absolutely. You know, if I knew, I would say not knowing what I didn't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would absolutely do it all over again. I do write in the book a little bit about going to a picnic at a lake, and if somebody told me that all these, this big list of stuff was going to be in the ground or the water nearby, would I go there? And it would be like absolutely not. But would I take that path and go to be an MP and go to basic training and MP school and all that? Absolutely.
Sure.
The other thing you could have asked me is you know should or how or why should veterans file a claim
Mm-hmm.
related to Fort McClellan? And I'm here to say, if you have a claim, file. And I'm not saying frivolously. We talked about it earlier, like the direct service connection. Don't just fling something at the wall and hope it sticks. Don't go on a fishing expedition. But if you have any of those any of the conditions that would be considered presumptive for herbicides or
Mm-hmm.
for even the burn pit stuff.
Yeah, the exposure to these toxic
Yeah,
chemicals.
any of it. I mean, I provide information to people all day long about different avenues and different, heavy metal, breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it like I said earlier, almost anything. Well, first of all, we know you can claim whatever you want. You can claim
Sure.
anything you want, right? But like almost anything in my book is there's a path to it through Fort McClellan. Okay. There's a politician who represents that district at the federal level who made a claim in 2014 and said if anybody that got illnesses from that were at Fort McClellan, they brought them with them. They didn't get it here, because he lives outside the gate and of course he has perfect health or something, has economic concerns, right? I'm here to say, and the VA secretary will say the same thing, file a claim. You've earned these benefits, and there's a path there. And I realize some people are just so burnt out and so tired, have been fighting this fight for a long time. There's people
Mm-hmm.
that are fighting it before me, but they've set the framework, and I mean there is a path forward now. I mean I wish I almost wish like my claims weren't filed before the PACT Act, because I would just be in such a better place, right? It's really hard
Would have zoomed
trying
right
to,
through
well, I don't know about that, but I've learned a
in
lot
comparison.
along the way, but I think I would have had a better chance. And I went to a CMP exam a couple months ago, and I saw the doctor, and she asked me why I'm there, and I tell her and give her my view based on what I know from the law and everything in the PACT Act. And she's like, when she looks at you and says, that's not how it works. I mean, you're screwed right there, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
expect that denial. I mean, there's a lot of, I'm going to say ignorance in the best way, right? There's so much lack of education on the side of the VA and the Raiders and the
And it's really a
examiners and
lack of
stuff.
curiosity as well. The
Yeah, and I
the
think,
government has a an inherent interest in not making things worse for themselves.
yeah, but the government's me and you and I. I mean, the
Yeah.
government's our neighbors, our friends. I mean, that's what I find mind-boggling too, is why some of these unelected bureaucrats are the roadblocks to righteous claims, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I get very frustrated when I read about some person that's a non-veteran somehow this system out of $800,000, and I get the door slammed in my face for what I would consider a righteous
Legitimate, no
claim or
kidding.
something,
Yeah.
or I read one not too long ago where a veteran assumed the ID of another veteran was getting paid at 100%. The other guy didn't know the other guy was using his identity. He died.
Wow.
The VA stopped the benefits, right? The fake guy convinced the VA that he was still alive, and they resumed his payments for like another 2 years till they figured out that he was actually, not the dead guy. Or like, I'm
Wow.
just like, how? How? I
No,
mean,
I've heard my own stories. There was a guy pretending to be blind, but had a driver's license, did all these things, but convinced the VA he was blind and was getting all these benefits. And I'm like, that's amazing, because like being blind is pretty significant.
yeah,
Like there should be a way to figure that out, but they don't always catch them. But I guess when you do, you hear about it in the news and you try to discourage others. And there's a lot of righteous claims out there, and there's a lot of people that are suffering from exposure to a lot of things, and they didn't know what caused it. And we're finding out now, just like with Agent Orange, just like with the Gulf War, with depleted uranium and exposure to chemical weapons, just like during the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns, there was a
yep,
lot of chemical exposure. There's a lot of things with the burn pits and water and a lot of things that we are now finding out about. Now, it's taken decades to get to that point, and sort of the culmination of that is the PACT Act. So, folks,
yeah,
if you have served in any of these places and you are having one of these presumptive conditions, and there's a lot of them, but if in general, if it's a cancer, if it's a heart issue, it's a liver issue, a kidney issue, so lots and lots of
yeah.
different cancers.
Respiratory issues, bone issues. I mean,
If
it's
it's one of those
literally,
unusual
yeah,
things,
a rare cancer. I mean, I see almost weekly. I mean, people, I got to go to the Google to figure it out. I don't even
mhm,
know, I've never even heard of it. And then you're like, wow, like 0.5% of the population gets this or something. But then
right.
when you dig into it, it's caused by exposure to something like trichloroethylene or
Mhm.
arsenic or something like that. So
So,
it's,
folks, go check out the book. And if you served at McClellan, you definitely have an avenue. Or if you served anywhere and you have had toxic exposures, Bill's done a great job, especially sort of Aniston writ large, because he does talk about the PCBs in the area and sort of the water and soil contamination from the herbicides, from radiological experiments, chemical and biological things. They're all there. So especially at Aniston, I think eventually one day we're going to have the full, complete story, or at least an advocate, kind of like Quantico and Lejeune, actually. But there's a difference in that Lejeune is still a base, and people are still there, still active, and so there's more of a groundswell as opposed to a place down in Alabama. Most people have never even heard of, and it's been closed for 25 years. And so you have people like Bill Bonk here wrote a fantastic book, and it's been updated. So the bigger text version is the newer version. It's easier to read, but it has lots of references and really great chapters into the different topics, and it really lays it out. So if you want to know what happened, a lot of good source primary materials are referenced. It's throughout the book. It's not, anecdotes like I heard from a guy who knew a guy whose cousin was there. These are official government documents. These are out there, and it lays out all the different parts and pieces. It's a fantastic book. I wouldn't say it's an easy read though, because there's a lot of government dry documents and lots of laying things out. But if you like evidence-based research, which I do, I'm a history buff. I love that kind of that merging of observation and history together, which is really what this book is all about. Go get it, pick it up. If you know somebody that served at McClellan, it's probably a good Christmas gift as we're headed towards the holidays. You get a copy, maybe even get Bill to sign it for you or something. Bill,
there you
I'm going
go.
to leave you with the last word. We've talked about a lot. We've talked about all these chemicals and all these problems from these chemicals. What's the one thing everybody should know about your book?
Well, based on your description, Tyler, I will say they're lucky they didn't read the earlier draft versions because it read like an IKEA assembly manual. But I mean, I I like how you framed it. I mean, the thing is, I wanted it to be credible,
Hmm.
and that's why it's based on government reports or newspaper articles that were contemporaneous for the time. And I'm reachable on social media. I mean, if anybody needs questions or needs info or documents or needs help or something, I'm not a VSO. I'm not a doctor, lawyer, or scientist. I'm glad to share whatever I can. Um, and I think the big takeaway is all those chemicals from going backwards from Iraq and Afghanistan to Vietnam. It's all the same stuff.
Hmm.
It's the burn pits. It's burning plastic and medical waste and metal and light bulbs and the ballast in bulbs and all that stuff. It's all the same stuff, and
Hmm.
I think that's what's disconcerting. We know that, right? And we keep subjecting our troops. When I say we, I mean collectively, the people of America, the government or whatever.
Hmm.
But I mean, do we ever really mitigate it, or I don't know. It's just it's a little sad that it falls on deaf ears, when you try to reach out to Congress or the Veterans Affairs committees or the VA, and it's sad that you have to get a celebrity or the president of the United States to speak about something to get some airtime. But I do appreciate you taking the time to talk about this book and Fort McClellan and toxic exposure everywhere, really. So I thank you very
It's a
much.
very important topic, and Bill, thank you for everything you've done for these veterans. It's a fantastic resource. It's obviously a labor of love to be able to do that, not only for your own edification, but then to write up a book and be able to share it with the tens of thousands of veterans that served at Fort McClellan and the many more family members that lived in the area, and the people that live around Anniston, Alabama now. I'm sure they all have a very significant interest in understanding what's happening around them because
Yeah.
these things don't go away, and people are moving on there, and they're living in those areas, and they may not understand what risk they're putting themselves at.
Yeah, and I do, I kind of failed to mention really, but the Women's Army Corps
Hmm.
started at Fort McClellan in the 50s and was there till 1978. And you hear these stories where they're the band members were in the parade field and their nylons were melting to their skin, because of the pesticides or herbicides in the lawns and stuff, or
Hmm.
how many of them had reproductive health issues and stuff like that. And they're kind of like the ones that are really left behind. You know, we kind of expect the chemical core people to be exposed to some bad things, right? But not to the detriment to their health, right?
Right.
I, I wrote a little bit in the book about people where they put a drop of mustard on your arm, and people are still carrying these blisters around as part of their training and stuff. I mean, it's just I don't know. I often wonder why we ignore the our veterans or these situations or something when it's people making bad, good, or indifferent decisions, right? I mean,
Yeah.
uh hard to understand sometimes,
It's
especially like
definitely a frustrating event where you see it happening over and over, and there's concrete proof, and there's
yeah.
just people have lost that corporate memory over the years. So there's no concrete evidence, but we know X and Y equals C, but we're
Yeah.
missing X or Y,
Well,
and
in the
we know
part
the
two,
results are.
you and I both at Fort McClellan could file for the exact same adverse health condition with the exact same evidence, and you walk away at 100% and I walk away denied.
Hmm.
Like that's something's not right with that equation. Like, and the fact that you got to go through and even though the burden of proof is pretty low at 50.01% to tip the scale, you get summarily denied. um and sometimes it's um if you don't have a nexus, if you don't have a current diagnosis, right, that's acceptable. I get that, right? But it's really frustrating to see people really suffering, likely from their service there at Fort McClellan. And they're, they're getting no benefits. I mean, they're getting no help, and there's, where's that benefit of the doubt rule and, some of that stuff. But
that's one of the biggest takeaways I have of the book is, there's a few basic rules with getting benefits. It's, you have an issue currently, you have to have something wrong with you, and you have to have some relation to your military service. Those are the two basic things.
Right.
But with Fort McClellan, they've decided there was no exposure to anything there. That's the official party line. And so simply because you were at Fort McClellan doesn't mean that you were exposed to X, Y, and Z. We know that isn't quite the case. It's no different than the fight between with Agent Orange and the people that were in Vietnam and the people around Vietnam and the people deploying it and all these other, the Blue Water Navy and the Brown Water Navy and all these other factors and conversations that eventually get resolved because it only makes sense. But yes, as you find out more, it becomes more infuriating about all these chemical exposures that we know about, that the government recognizes that there's exposures and there's these bad things there. However, the party line is officially, there's no specific exposure just because you served at Fort McClellan.
Yeah.
Even though that may not be the case. And
or
so
it's the time thing too, right? So Camp Lejeune, you had to do 30 cumulative days over a 34-year period, right? So you could have went one weekend a year for 15 years and had 30 days, right? So because people sometimes will bring up this like, oh, you were only there for basic training, or you were only there for 4 months. Well, look at Camp Lejeune. I won't say what look at exposure to, say, something like carbon monoxide. How long does that take to affect you, right?
Right.
I mean, a couple, under an hour maybe or something like that. So, when in the damage that's done, sometimes the acute exposure is worse than the chronic. Sometimes the chronic's worse than the acute. I mean, and again, in the book, I don't try to at all weigh how much somebody was exposed. It's just very simply, look, there was, nickel and, cadmium in the water, and, somebody was exposed to that.
Absolutely.
I don't care if it was, 0.001% of, they go into all this stuff about, background levels and screening levels. And the funny thing is too, if you really start digging into it, and I will say one thing about the book too, is like, I spent a good amount of time on the shenanigans and the omissions and, the
errors of omission and commission.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a lot of stuff goes on, and you just got to shake your head and then you see these, the corporate discontinuity stuff. And I mean, it was a mess. And then if you go even further and look at like the national academies, what they have to say about stuff, they're like, we'll never know what happened in Vietnam. And then you're like, oh my God, there's so much policy and decisions made related to VA healthcare. Yet the national academies in 2018 basically says, you know what, this is a crapshoot and we don't know anything. So
Bill, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well. I appreciated the book. I appreciate the fact that you did this as a labor of love and really a service for your fellow veterans. Bill, it's a fantastic book. And folks, I'll put the link up on the show notes, and we'll put it all in the social media, so you'll be able to just click on it and go find it if you're interested in a copy. Maybe your local library will have a copy. If they don't, you can ask them. A lot of times, if you ask a library for a book, they'll go get it for you if you don't want to buy it, but go buy it. It's a great book, and it's been well-resourced. Bill, again, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Thank you, Tyler. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Pieron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, Please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.